Someone actually did this. They sat down, opened a chat window with Grok, and typed a question that Egyptologists have spent 2 centuries trying to answer with pics. Brushes and radiocarbon dates. Who built the Sphinx? And the internet lit up with claims that the answer stunned scientists. Before you believe that headline, you need to know 2 things at once. You need to know what we actually know about the Great Sphinx of Giza, built on bedrock, backed by inscriptions, tool marks, and nearly 200 years of excavation. And you need to know what a chatbot can and cannot do when you ask it a question like that. Because the real story here isn't a machine cracking a 5,000-year-old secret. It's stranger and more useful than that. It's a story about how easy it has become to mistake a confident paragraph for a discovery, and how the actual evidence sitting in the Giza Plateau is interesting enough that it never needed the exaggeration in the first place. Let's start with the monument itself, because most people have seen a photograph of the Sphinx 100 times and could not tell you a single verified fact about it. It sits on the Giza Plateau on the west bank of the Nile, just south of the Great Pyramid, carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock that was left in place after builders quarried the softer surrounding stone to construct the pyramid complex nearby. It stretches about 73 meters from paw to tail, stands roughly 20 meters high, and its face is about 4 meters wide. It is, by volume, one of the largest single-block stone sculptures on Earth, and unlike the pyramids, it was not built up from transported blocks. It was carved downward and outward from the living rock of the plateau itself, which is part of why its geology tells such a complicated story. The body is a reclining lion, the head wears a royal Nemes headcloth, the striped cloth associated with Egyptian kingship, and at one point it also wore a false ceremonial beard and a uraeus, the cobra emblem of royal authority, both of which have since broken away and now exist only as fragments, some housed in the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The mainstream dating of the Sphinx rests on more than tradition. It rests on a specific physical piece of evidence, the causeway and valley temple connected to the Pyramid of Khafre, the 4th dynasty pharaoh who reigned during the 26th century BCE, are built from the same limestone quarried out of the Sphinx enclosure, and they are aligned with the Sphinx in a way that indicates they were designed and executed as a single construction project. The blocks used in Khafre's Valley Temple show the same quarrying technique, the same stone type, and were removed at a scale consistent with the depth of the Sphinx enclosure itself. Add to that the fact that the Sphinx Temple, same architectural style, using core blocks of comparable size and cut in the same period, and you have a coherent, physically linked construction sequence rather than 3 unrelated monuments that happen to sit near each other. There is also art historical evidence. The face of the Sphinx, weathered as it is, has been compared by Egyptologists to surviving statues of Khafre, including a well-preserved diorite statue of the pharaoh found in his valley temple, and the proportions, the style of headdress, and the treatment of the brow show consistency with royal portraiture of that specific dynasty rather than with earlier or later periods. None of this proves identity the way a signed document would, because the Sphinx carries no inscription naming its builder from the time of its construction. But it is a body of converging physical and stylistic evidence, not a guess inherited uncritically from tour guides. It's worth pausing on how the quarrying itself worked, because it explains a lot about why the Sphinx looks the way it does. Old Kingdom quarrymen used copper chisels, stone pounders, and wooden wedges soaked with water to split the limestone along its natural bedding planes, working the outcrop. From the top down in step terraces, gradually isolating the shape of a reclining animal from the surrounding rock rather than building it up from separate blocks, the way the pyramids were built. That process left the Sphinx literally embedded in a trench, lower than the surrounding plateau, which is exactly why it has been buried up to its neck in wind-blown sand for most of its history, and why it needed to be periodically rediscovered and re-excavated by later generations of Egyptians, and eventually by modern archaeologists. This quarrying method is also why the harder and softer bands of limestone run horizontally through the body in visible layers, since the quarrymen were working with the rock's natural stratigraphy rather than against it, and it's a major part of why erosion across the body is so uneven from one section to the next. There's a genuine scholarly debate about whether Khafre himself commissioned the Sphinx or whether the project began earlier, under his father Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. Some Egyptologists, including Rainer Stadelmann, a former director of the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, argued based on stylistic comparisons of the face that it more closely resembles depictions of Khufu than Khafre, and proposed that Khufu began the Sphinx as part of his own pyramid complex before Khafre completed it and folded it into his. This view has not displaced the Khafre attribution as the dominant position, but it illustrates something important. The disagreement inside. Mainstream Egyptology is not about whether the Sphinx belongs to the 4th dynasty in the Old Kingdom, a conclusion supported by quarry marks, construction technique, and the physical connection to the surrounding temple complex. The disagreement is a narrower, more technical one about exactly which of two related pharaohs, father or son, initiated the specific project, argued from art history rather than fringe redating. That distinction rarely survives translation into a viral headline, but it's the actual shape of the uncertainty that exists among specialists. That absence of a contemporary inscription is worth sitting with for a moment because it's the seed of every alternative theory that follows. The oldest surviving text that mentions the Sphinx by name is the Dream Stele, a granite slab placed between the paws by the pharaoh Thutmose IV more than 1,000 years after Khafre's reign. It describes a dream in which the Sphinx, referred to in the text as a form of the sun god Hora-Makhet, promised Thutmose the throne of Egypt if he cleared the sand burying its body. That stele tells us the Sphinx was already ancient, already partly buried, and already treated as a sacred image by the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1,400 years before the Common Ra. It does not name Khafre as the builder. A separate artifact called the Inventory Stele, found in the 19th century, does claim to describe the Sphinx already standing in the time of Khufu, Khafre's father, which would push its construction earlier still, but that to be a much later composition, likely from the 21st or 22nd dynasty, written in a style and using titles that don't match the Old Kingdom period it claims to describe. It's treated as a piece of religious or political storytelling from a much later era, not a contemporary record. This is the honest state of the evidence. Strong circumstantial and physical grounds point to Khafre's reign for the Sphinx's construction. There is genuine scholarly discussion about whether it was Khafre, or possibly begun under Khufu, and there is no surviving inscription that settles the question beyond doubt. That is not a scandal. That is what history before writing became fully bureaucratic and self-documenting actually looks like. Most ancient monuments carry some degree of uncertainty about exact authorship, and archaeologists are usually upfront about it. The problem is that upfront uncertainty doesn't generate views the way a claim about a hidden 1,000-year-older civilization does. Now to the part of the story that fuels almost saint every viral claim about the Sphinx. Erosion. If you look closely at the walls of the enclosure that surrounds the Sphinx, the trench that was carved out to free its body from the surrounding bedrock, you will see vertical, undulating grooves running down the limestone. In the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch, then at Boston University, argued that this pattern of erosion was consistent with prolonged, heavy rainfall, rather than the wind and sand erosion that dominates Egypt's climate today. Since Egypt's last period of significantly wetter climate ended roughly 6,000 years ago or earlier, at the close of what climatologists call the African humid period, Schoch argued the Sphinx enclosure must be significantly older than the 4th dynasty, potentially by thousands of years, to have accumulated that kind of water-driven weathering. This is a real hypothesis, published by a credentialed geologist, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than dismissed with a shrug or inflated into settled fact, because both distortions happen constantly online. What actually happened after Schoch published his findings is that the wider community of geologists who work on Egyptian limestone weathering, people like Egyptologist and geologist K. Lalgori, examined the same enclosure walls and largely disagreed with the water erosion conclusion. Their counterargument centers on the specific composition of Giza limestone, which is not uniform. It's made of alternating layers of harder and softer rock, some of it quite soft and rich in clay minerals, laid down in ancient seabeds with different mineral content layer by layer. When this kind of layered limestone is exposed to any moisture at all, including the modest rainfall and, more significantly, the heavy morning dew and groundwater capillary action that does occur in the region even in dry climates, along with salt crystallization from evaporating groundwater, it can weather into rounded, undulating patterns that closely resemble rainfall erosion without requiring the kind of sustained heavy rain Schoch describes. This process, sometimes called haline or subsurface weathering, is well documented in arid limestone environments worldwide and indeed does not require a wetter climate to explain the grooves in the enclosure. Other geologists have also pointed out that the differential hardness of the rock layers alone, eroded slowly over 4,500 years by wind, occasional rain, and salt action, produces exactly this kind of banded, wave-like surface without needing to move the date back by thousands of years. So where does that leave the honest viewer? It leaves you with a genuine published scientific disagreement between a minority position, Schoch's water erosion hypothesis, and a majority position held by most working Egyptologists and geologists. That differential weathering of layered limestone over the conventional 4,500-year time frame adequately explains what we see. Schoch's work has not been widely accepted in peer-reviewed geology, but it also was not simply invented by cranks. It's a minority scientific claim that lost the argument in its field, which is a very different thing from a suppressed truth. Presenting it as either completely debunked nonsense or as a secret, the establishment doesn't want you to know W are both inaccurate. The accurate version is less dramatic and more interesting. Two groups of scientists looked at the same rock and reached different conclusions about how water, salt, and time interact with a specific ancient stone, and one explanation currently has significantly more supporting data and specialist consensus behind it than the other. The head-to-body proportion is the next claim that gets circulated constantly. The idea that the head is too small for the body and must have been recarved from something else, implying the original sculpture was a different creature entirely. It's true that the head does look proportionally smaller than you'd expect on a lion of that body length, and this has been noted by Egyptologists for a long time, not hidden or discovered recently by anyone, human or artificial. But there's a much more mundane explanation than a secret recarving from an unknown origin, owl form. The Sphinx's body, being carved from a single mass of variably hard bedrock, degraded far more than its head, which was carved from a harder, more resistant section of the outcrop, higher up and more exposed D. As the softer body weathered and was later repaired repeatedly, using loose stone masonry to patch and rebuild eroded sections across multiple periods of Egyptian history, including restoration work during the New Kingdom under Thutmose IV, and again, during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, the body's outline and volume changed, while the harder original head survived largely intact in its original proportions. In other words, the apparent mismatch likely comes from differential erosion and centuries of patchwork, repilier replacement carved atop an older, larger original form. This is documented in excavation reports going back to the work of Émile Barrès in the 1920s, and confirmed by later restoration teams working on the Sphinx through the 20th century, who mapped the different masonry phases layer by layer. The missing nose is probably the single most repeated piece of misinformation about the Sphinx, and it's worth clearing up because it demonstrates how myths about this monument get created and spread even without any AI involved at all. Popular legend blames Napoleon's soldiers for shooting the nose off with a cannon during his Egyptian campaign in 1798. This did not happen. Sketches of the Sphinx made decades base. Before Napoleon was born, including one by the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden published in 1755, already show the nose missing. The most credible historical account comes from the 15th century Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, who recorded that a Sufi preacher named Muhammad Saim al-Dahr defaced the Sphinx in the year 1378, angered that local farmers were making offerings to it in hopes of a good harvest, treating it as an object of idol worship. Al-Makrizi wrote to the man was later executed for vandalism by an outraged crowd. So the nose was very likely removed deliberately, centuries before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt, for religious reasons rather than as an act of war. That's a case where the truth is more historically textured than the myth, and it required nothing more exotic than reading a 15th century Arabic chronicle to find it. Now let's talk honestly about the astronomical claims, because this is where the video titles get the most extravagant. The idea that the Sphinx was oriented to face a particular constellation rising on the spring equinox during a specific ancient epoch, sometimes called the Age of Leo, comes primarily from the work of Robert Bovell and Graham Hancock in the 1990s, building on Schoch's redating. It's true that due to a slow wobble in Earth's rotational axis called axial precession, the constellation that appears to rise just before the Sun on the spring equinox does shift over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, and it's true that roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, the constellation Leo would have occupied that position in the sky as seen from Giza. The argument built from this is that the Sphinx, as a lion facing east, was designed to mark that specific astronomical epoch, meaning it must have been built or conceived then. The trouble with this argument is that it starts by assuming the conclusion. It requires you to already accept the earlier redating in order for the astronomical alignment to mean anything, since a monument built in 2500 BCE facing east on the equinox has an entirely mundane and well-attested explanation. The sun rising due east on the equinox was one of the single most important, most universally observed phenomena in ancient Egyptian religion and architecture, tied directly to solar worship, and countless Egyptian temples across multiple dynasties were deliberately built on precise east-west solar axes for that reason alone, with no connection to any particular constellation required. Professional archaeoastronomers, including Anthony Avini, who has spent decades studying alignments in ancient monuments worldwide, have pointed out that the Leo alignment argument treats a coincidence of geometry, a lion facing east, as if it required a specific stellar explanation, when solar alignment alone fully accounts for the orientation using evidence we already have from the rest of Egyptian religious architecture. This is also where claims about a global network of monuments sharing identical angular relationships tend to fall apart under scrutiny. When you have enough ancient structures on Earth and enough possible angles to measure between them, some numerical relationships will appear by chance, a well-known statistical trap researchers call the multiple comparisons problem. Draw enough lines between enough ancient sites, and you will always find some angles that look meaningful, the same way you can find shapes in clouds. Serious comparative archaeology, the kind published in peer-reviewed journals, requires a specific, testable, falsifiable prediction made in advance, not lines drawn after the fact between whichever monuments happen to support the story. No credible peer-reviewed study has established a coordinated global building network connecting Giza to sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey or the temples of the Andes, and radiocarbon dating places these sites many thousands of years apart from one another, built by cultures with no demonstrated contact, using completely different construction techniques, materials, and religious symbolism. Which brings us to Grok, and to the honest answer to the question in the title. When you ask a large language model like Grok, or ChatGPT, or Claude, who built the Sphinx, or ask it to analyze erosion data and produce a confidence percentage, it does not have a laser scanner. It cannot walk out to the Giza Plateau and take new measurements. It cannot run an independent geological survey. What it can do is generate fluent, confident-sounding text based on patterns in the text it was trained on. And if you ask it to produce a number, a percentage, a date range, it will often generate one that sounds precise and scientific because that is the style of language it has learned to produce, not because it performed a calculation grounded in real sensor data, unless you have actually fed it a verified dataset yourself and asked it to run explicit statistical analysis on it, which is not what typically happens in these viral videos. A number, like a 94.7% confidence rating, unless it comes from an explicitly documented model with a stated methodology, a data source, and a margin of error, is not evidence. It is a stylistic flourish that mimics the sound of evidence. And treating any chatbot's fluent T-output as an independent scientific instrument is the actual mistake sitting at the center of this entire genre of video, whether the topic is the Sphinx, ancient aliens, or lost continents. It's also worth understanding just how many hands have touched the Sphinx across its long life, because that history is largely responsible for its current appearance, and is sometimes mistaken for evidence of a hidden older structure underneath. Thutmose IV's restoration around 1400 BCE, the one recorded on the Dream Stele, involve declearing accumulated sand and adding masonry patches to the paws and chest, some of which survive today and are visually distinct from the original bedrock because they're built from separate quarried block S rather than carved from the living rock. Centuries later, during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, further repairs were carried out, including work connected to Roman-era administrators, who took a specific interest in maintaining the monument as a religious and tourist site, since Greek and Roman visitors were already writing about the Sphinx as an ancient wonder by that point, much as modern tourists do today. In the 20th century, Egyptian archaeologist Émile Barrès led a major excavation and restoration effort in the 1920s, followed by further conservation work through the rest of the century and into the 2000s by the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, and later the Supreme Council of Antiquities, using modern masonry. Techniques to stabilize sections of the body that had begun to flake and crumble due to rising groundwater, humidity, and pollution from nearby Cairo. Each of these interventions left a visible seam in the stone, a patchwork of different repair styles from different centuries, and modern geological surveys of the body have carefully mapped which sections are original bedrock and which pipes. Chiche are added masonry from each restoration period. None of this patchwork points toward a hidden earlier monument. It points toward exactly what you'd expect from a single ancient sculpture that has been actively maintained, more or less continuously, for roughly 4,500 years. The Sphinx Temple, sitting directly in front of the monument, deserves its own mention because it's frequently left out of viral retellings, even though it's some of the strongest physical evidence tying the whole site together. Built from massive limestone core blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, quarried from the same enclosure that produced the Sphinx itself. The temple originally held a colonnade of pillars and was oriented on the same east-west solar axis as the Sphinx, positioned so that on the equinox, the sun would set directly between the two pyramids of Khafre and Khufu when viewed from within the temple. That alignment is well documented, precisely measured by modern surveyors, and entirely consistent with the mainstream explanation: 4th dynasty Egyptian solar religion, not a hidden stellar calendar from an unknown prior epoch. The temple's construction technique, using the same megalithic core masonry style E found in the Valley Temple of Khafre a short distance away, is one of the clearest physical threads connecting the Sphinx enclosure, the Sphinx Temple, and Khafre's mortuary complex into a single coordinated building project, rather than 3 separate monuments from different eras that happen to end up next to each other. This doesn't mean AI tools are useless for history or archaeology, quite the opposite. Machine learning genuinely has been used to help decipher damaged ancient texts, to reconstruct fragmentary manuscripts, to analyze satellite imagery for buried structures, and to model erosion patterns when researchers feed it real, verified physical measurements, and ask it to run defined statistical comparisons. That is legitimate, valuable work, and it's happening at universities right now. What is not legitimate is typing a leading question into a chatbot, receiving a fluent paragraph back, and presenting that paragraph as if a machine independently uncovered a suppressed truth that stunned the scientific establishment. Real scientists were not stunned because real scientists were not in the room. The stunning, if any, happens in the comment section, not the peer-reviewed literature. So here is where that leaves the actual, still genuine mystery of the Sphinx, because there is one, and it doesn't need any exaggeration to be interesting. We do not have a contemporary inscription naming its builder. We do not fully know why, of all the animals available to Old Kingdom Egyptian religious symbolism, a lion with a royal human head was chosen for this specific location, though scholars generally connect it to the sun god and to royal power, since lions guarding sacred sites appear elsewhere in Egyptian iconography. We don't have complete certainty about every phase of its early history before the New Kingdom, because the written record from the Old Kingdom is thin, and the physical evidence, while strong, is circumstantial. Every one of these open questions is being actively worked on by real Egyptologists, geologists, and archaeoastronomers, using excavation records, ground-penetrating radar surveys that have been conducted by legitimate research teams and published with their actual findings, isotope analysis, and careful comparative study of Old Kingdom art. That is slower and less cinematic than a machine, handing you a stunning revelation in 90 seconds. But it's also how we actually know anything true about the deep past, one carefully checked claim at a time, with room left for honest disagreement where the evidence runs out. The Great Sphinx has survived nearly 4,500 years of wind, sun, buried sand, deliberate defacement, and repeated restoration, and it is still standing there facing the sunrise, exactly as impressive without a secret 12,000-year-old backstory as it is with one. If anything, knowing the real, contested, occasionally frustrating evidence behind it makes it more remarkable, not less, because it means the monument survived on the strength of what it actually is, rather than what an algorithm was prompted to say about it. If this kind of grounded, fact-checked look at ancient history is what you actually want more of, subscribe, because there's a lot more of the ancient world worth getting right, and a lot more viral claims about it worth checking before you believe them. Drop a comment with the next ancient mystery you want taken apart carefully, evidence first, hype last, and I'll see you in the next one.